Rick kindly was able to provide me a movie, very short movie of it. I think it's a minute or two, just to reinforce what we were talking about. And I understand this is the Ouse River, is that right? And they would have had to, you would have had to construct that in order to get some wind farm components. This is part of the tower.
108 tonne.
So it's 108 tonne, 1/5 of a tower. So you've had to construct part of the road deliberately in order to be able to get this vehicle. And here we have a turbine blade. How big did you say?
68 metre blade, but total length 80 metres.
So you can see they've actually done work through here to actually create the road big enough to be able to get it around. And whilst this is a large blade, as you know, from a wind farm perspective, 68 is pretty big. Even at 40 odd metres, where a lot of them in recent times, like the V90s and that, have 45 metre blades, 45 is still huge. I mean, you're talking about these specially constructed vehicles turning front and back.
Yeah, so those back wheels, Dan, are
fully articulated.
Yeah, they drive, the vehicle behind is driving the back wheels.
By remote?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. That cuts down your cost on the road.
Yep. Yeah, because you don't have to have your transmission length all the way through. Yep. So that shows that this is a normal thing for wind farms.
Really?
Moving big turbines onto wind farms aren't built in areas generally that you have really nice wide highways right next door. They're generally areas with remote, good wind resources, etc. So you have these issues to get to site quite often. And this is just remarkable. I'm really glad you showed us this, Rick. But it's a, you know, how many turbines are going up Cattle Hill?
48.
48.
Yeah.
This is, and how many blades?
3.
So you got
2 on 100, what's that? 3 times 48.
154. 144. 144 times this is going to happen.
Dan, if I could just add,
yes,
a total of 528 loads, which is pick up your point about, you know, planning for the road transport is very important. 528 oversized components.
That's fantastic. Yep.
Yeah, I'm more interested in who has proposed this development. Is that the government's proposed?
No, this wind farm is a private development.
Private?
Most wind farms are private development. This is it'll be a financed or, you know, different financial arrangements. Most of them, because you're talking about electricity generation. And you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investment, but you're generating electricity and selling it over 25, 30 year life, so you've got a return on your investment. So this, goes through the process through the EPA, because being a large scale wind farm is a level 2 assessment. Things like, I'm going to have to do stuff to the road to bring the turbines in, to bring the components in, is part of what you're detailing an application. They'll have requirements of traffic management plans, pre-construction surveys of the road. They'll have all of these things that you then have to go and do as a secondary consent to develop this up in detail. So you'll be saying, this part of the road I've got to widen, I've got to be into Bob Smith's land, I'll have to compensate Bob for a period of time. While I've got to move his fence, I'll then have to move it back, make it good, and go through this for all the corners that you need to work on. You might have to upgrade the road surface because of the weight. How much tonnage was on the
blades or on the tower?
The tower was...
The tower was 108 tonne. These are only about 30 tonne, these blades.
So, most of your highways will cover really heavy loads, but rough highways. So you'll have deformation surveys to understand if I've actually wrecked the road, so they'll survey it before and afterwards. I have to fix the road. All of this will be then detailed as part of a a really comprehensive set of plans prior to construction, and all be signed off by the appropriate people.
Yeah, I'm quite certain there's a lot of assessment involved. I'm just out of curious, how long does it take to get approval of this proposal?
Rick,
Oh, a very, very, very long time.
probably,
Because of Commonwealth, state and local, and it's like Dan said before, many years.
I'm trying to think out. We're involved in helping out with some of the Eagle surveys, but that would have been 5 or 6 years
In
ago.
2006, this was first mooted.
First moved.
Yeah, so, but like a project, sometimes it's going to start, then it stops, and then it's going to start, and then it stops. This one took a long time, but to answer your question, that maybe full time, maybe 2 years or 3 years to get it all the approvals, environmental approval, planning. Lots of money, millions and millions of dollars.
And that's why we're saying, you know, we're talking about the value of these investments in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But they're obviously worthwhile, and as Rick said, you know, depending upon what's happening with renewable energy credits and, you know, global situations and what the federal governments do, sometimes they're viable, seen as viable, and sometimes they're put on hold because the market may be changing slightly.
Yeah.
But fantastic video, thanks Rick.
Yeah, no worries.
Of course, you know I'm going to steal that now and use it.
Yeah.
Just you know.
Just tell Goldwyn, that's all.
I'll go and see John.
Yes.
Please,
Yeah.
can I?
Yeah.
Is John's copyright or yours? You're the photographer.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not a copyright lawyer.
No, it's okay. I won't use it. Okay. So. I briefly want to go through, and while some of these slides are going to be somewhat detail orientated, I don't want to spend a lot of time on them, so they're more as examples. So we talked about, you know, one of these really important things, you know, right up top on the list, description and location. You know, why is it important? Well, I need to know the extent of it. Am I on this part of the site or that part of the site? Am I got, you know, various components? How long is it taking? You know, working out who the landowner is. You know, because we might think, oh, well, it's Bob Smith. But then I realise, oh, well, there's actually a component, because I'm connecting to the trans line and I need to run a new, you know, 11 kV trans line. It's running over the neighbour's property. Okay, we're now expanding the extent of our application. And therefore understanding correctly the jurisdictions. And obviously where we are on the site and what we're doing is what triggers zones and overlays and applications of codes. Oh, I'm doing a house. Well, now it's a sensitive use and I'm in the bushfire overlay. Oh, no, I'm not doing a house, I'm doing something else. Therefore, it's not a sensitive use, therefore the code doesn't apply. Becomes very important. And from a project risk perspective, in that feasibility process, you know, it helps you analyse that risk, understanding what those risks are properly. Now, I mentioned the other day about high water mark. You know, that can really pay havoc, particularly if you've got part of the scheme that talks about high water mark or, you know, distance from the high water mark or things like that. And the accuracy of the mapping. If I'm relying on TasVeg or I'm relying upon a biodiversity code that's reliant upon TasVeg, and TasVeg was mapped at 1 to 200,000, and it's showing, you know, it covers this block and we can see that it's completely vacant. That's because of the accuracy of the mapping. Therefore, you know, your application may be saying, well, it's in the biodiversity code and it says that only applies if I'm removing native vegetation and this is a ploughed paddock and has been for 50 years, so therefore I'm not removing native vegetation, therefore the code's not applicable. But over the road is, which is heavily vegetated, but due to the mapping accuracy error, isn't included in the biodiversity code. It happens. And then obviously the issues with the jurisdictions that can crop up. I talked about the other day about the bilateral agreement and trying to marry assessment guidelines between both if we're working between the feds and the state. From involving marine farming and marine farming offshore is not subject to the planning scheme, but the onshore components are. From doing dam works, the works within the inundation area and the dam face dealt with under the Water Management Act and are outside the scheme, but vegetation clearance for access to or connection of access to the roads is within the planning scheme. You know, from crossing council municipal boundaries. As I said, I had one time where we had the extraction industry here and the access road runs in Sorrel and the access road was in Clarence. And of course, if I'm involved in Commonwealth land or airports, and that throws this back to the issue of jurisdiction and whether or not they need to seek formal approval. So, you can see why it's important to understand what we're doing and where we are. And what does this lead to? This leads to how we're classified under a scheme. Now you can look at these. These are the things you should be looking at in your case study anyway. I've just stolen this out of something I did. Within the entry planning scheme, the use of the land for a service station is defined as this. So there's a definition of service station. This falls within a use class of vehicle sales, fuel sales and service, which is defined as this. In the zone, this then uses this use class. It doesn't use service station. So I've actually got to follow the bouncing ball to understand what the use class is. In the general residential zone, you know, vehicle and fuel sales is prohibited. Okay. The zones for residential development and only has a limited range of commercial stuff. Therefore, I need to rezone it. Quite successfully, I might add, but anyway. So you can see how you follow the bouncing ball to get from what I want to do to how it's classified under the scheme to what that means in process. Then, once I know what the site zone, what the use is classified as, the extent, the nature of the activities, I can start looking at what are the appropriate provisions and requirements under the scheme. What are the key issues? This is a really important one. What are those additional application documentation I'm likely to be required? I'm doing something in Kingborough and I'm within, let's use an example of a wind farm development. I'm in Kingborough and that says that I'll need, within that code, I'll need to have a visual impact assessment. Well, I'm silly to go into council and lodge an application without one because they're just going to turn around and write me a letter asking for one. And because I can see that they're going to ask me for one. So I then know what I've got to do. I can advise my client. I don't understand the time frame and the cost to provide the information. So my client's like, oh, well, we want to lodge this on next week. No, mate, we're going to have to go through a visual impact assessment. Going to have to get someone to do it. It's going to take this long to do, etc. It's going to cost you this much to get it done. And we talked before about, how much detail should I be putting in the documentation. And we've said this is, optimal is what I think is necessary to be assessed properly. You only use minimum if it's a strategy to try to make council to ask you deliberately what they want because they're unclear or they refuse to tell you. And they could ask you for one of 10 things, but they won't tell you. Okay, I'll put in the minimum, you tell me what you want. But that strategy should be discussed with the client. This, unless the client is made of gold, then no client or anyone is going to want to do that. I'll lodge a visual impact assessment for Mrs. Smith's upstairs extension. You don't have to. Oh, but I will anyway, because it's a really good idea. Make it look good. And, it means my application will be 700 pages instead of 30.
So if you're seeking a social licence, you might gold plate things, might you?
It's a really different one. If you feel that there's a social licence issue, wind farm, we keep coming back to wind farm, but they're a great situation you find yourself in where you end up with haves and have-nots and people who impact but have no financial benefit and therefore want something tangible. You know, me too, you have small communities. The gold plating isn't normally in terms of documentation. The documentation should be enough for you to make a determination. What you might decide to do, and there was a recent decision on this for a solar farm in Victoria where the applicant's saying, well, we want to do these things for the community. We want to be involved in sponsoring these things on the community. And the BCAT have said, yeah, well, we can't put a condition on there about it, but the applicant is still, because it's outside the scope of the planning scheme. And the applicant's saying, yeah, but this is what we normally do. Because, you know, we pay compensation to the people we've got. You know, or we buy the land and we may be compensation issues around that and access. But we also want to put money back into the community because we think there's a community obligation, because we're going to be here as a long-term neighbour and we're going to be operating for a long time. So we want to be a valued member of the community. So that social licence aspect and involvement and investment in the social fabric and the local economy is generally outside the document detail, but it is part of the documentation detail. It's very clear, VCAT have made a very clear decision, yes, but they won't be putting on a permit about it, a condition about it. Which makes it very hard for people to be guaranteed that's going to happen. Because it means if VCAT aren't putting a condition on about it, council's not enforcing it. And then obviously, if we trigger one of our higher order assessment processes, we're likely to therefore have to be getting that assessment guidelines, which may mean we have lots of this in order to get adequate documentation. Now, I talked before about fatal flaws assessment. I pulled this out of something which was a Transline upgrade I did for AusNet Services. We did a very preliminary assessment for them just to give them a cook's tour of what are the pinch points, what are the key risks. And so it's a 70 kilometre stretch of Transline, runs across 4 shires in Victoria, whole bunch of zones. This is where I started talking about, is there a problem with the permission or permissibility along the way? See, this is the table I used. Here are my shires, here are my codes that sit on the planning scheme, because I gave them maps as well. Here are the relevant sections of the planning schemes. This is what it means. So these are the permit required. Section 2 is a discretionary application. That's fine. Run into a problem. Fatal flaw. So this is how I talked about it. This is an area around a ravine and a river, and it's within that area that they're basically saying, well, you can't do it. But because we were spanning it with and this relates to development, spanning it with the poles on either side, we weren't touching it. We also had an argument of an existing use right, if they want to look at it from a perspective of use. So, actually no, sorry, I've led you astray there. There was no control with regard to development. The issue was with use. And in Victoria, they separate use and development. So buildings and works were okay. It was the issue of whether or not the use was prohibited. And because we were upgrading an existing line, as opposed to building a new one, well, call it upgrading, we were losing, there it is. This was the existing lines, run up one side, we were putting one on the other side. So we weren't building any new towers, we were running new double circuit line across there. So in this case, it was very much about the existing use. It didn't qualify to be development. What the issue was is, under legislation, you have a right to clear from lines. We had vegetation here. So in doing this, we would create an exemption for vegetation clearance, so therefore we had to assess the vegetation clearance that would arise out of building these lines, which means anything within here needed a permit for vegetation clearance. So this is a process going through, providing information, you know, identifying a fatal flaw. Similarly with the overlays. You know, it's a good way of doing it. Are any of these going to cause an issue? Some of them, you know, are exempt because the development wasn't triggered, doesn't trigger an assessment on the overlay. These ones said council may require a site analysis and a visual assessment. You know, environmental management report may be required. So this means to flag, well, here are the things, you know, this is likely to require a flora and fauna assessment. So we could go to council and talk about these things and say, well, this is what we want to do, are you going to ask for this? But it gave AusNet Services a reasonable confidence that there shouldn't be too much of an issue from a fatal flaws perspective, because they're all able to be applied for. There were no real key issues, there were no real issues. The vegetation clearance, as long as we could find offsetting and go through that, we should be able to show that it was okay. Offsetting is a whole another issue. And of course, once I can do that and look at, is it permitted, is it not, you know, identifying whether it's permitted or whether it's discretionary is important. Now we talked about before, and so I know I'm flipping between a Victorian example and a Tassie example. But if we come back to Tassie, then we're saying, well, when is it permitted? If it's a permitted use class, if I meet all the acceptable standards, if there are no other discretionary criteria under the planning scheme, and if it's not prohibited for any other reason, then I'm permitted, I don't need advertising. Discretionary, it's either discretionary under the zone, called in specifically in the overlay or another provision, or I'm relying on the performance criteria. And if you remember what I said last time, only that matter which is discretionary is subject to the discretion of council. So you couldn't refuse something by virtue of exceeding the height standard. You couldn't refuse it on the ground it was painted pink. Then we get into, therefore, the standards within the zone. So when, and this is really relevant to you guys when you're writing this planning assessment report, because this is what's actually triggering the planning assessment report. So the planning authority must take into consideration all the standards and requirements. Well, that's what you're setting out. Any representations received within the time frame. So that just describes the process of receiving representation. But in the exercise of discretion, this is the wording they use for what I just said, only so far as each such matter is relevant to the discretion. So that's why we write a plans report. And then when I'm looking at the discretionary use, here are the other things. The purpose, any relevant local area objectives, purpose of the codes, specific area, purpose of any specific area plan, or the requirements of any site-specific qualification. Again, limited in discretion. So this is where our local area objectives get pulled into. So if I'm permitted use, I don't get to examine those, because it's taken as being I meet the acceptable solution or I'm right. What does that mean? In an example, okay, this is one I was doing for a service station, that service station one earlier. So here's an example of acceptable solutions. They have the prefix of A, performance standards have the prefix of P. In my report, of course, I had a better heading than that. I've just cut a bit out to show you. So the standard says external lighting for a use, so this is a use standard, must only operate within a particular time, doesn't include security lighting, and if it's for security lighting, be baffled so it's direct lights only shining on the side. Okay? If I can show that that's the case, I make the acceptable solution. If I can't, then I'm into, talked about this subjective nature before, unreasonable loss of potential or actual amenity. I love the word potential amenity. What's potential amenity? I don't know what it is, but anyway. So that's having regard to where people are placed, how much lighting I've got on, how long it's going for, etc. So it's now saying make a case, and it's subjective. In this case, I had a 24-hour-a-day fuel depot. So it was one of those card and truck stops, not the mood food where you can buy your sandwiches and chips. It was pull in, get out, swipe the card, fill up your truck, get back in your truck, drive off. So Bennett's Petroleum, you see a bunch of those around the state. This was one of those. So my answer in how I addressed it as the applicant was, yes, I'm operating 24 hours a day. So yep, I'm on to here because I'm not limiting. And direct light spill will be contained on the proposal site through design. Why? Because I'm only wanting to illuminate the middle of the site. I'm not interested in, going around the outside. The other one, overlooking a private space, does not occur. In this case, I'm saying, well, the proposal complies with A4 because we've got current open fencing of the site. Site's ring lock fence between them and the neighbours. So I'm not increasing any overlooking of the private open space by virtue of this development. If anything, I'm actually reducing it because I'm actually putting buildings there and no one's living there. So actually there's going to be less sea across the site into the neighbours' open space, and I'm not having anyone on site to overlook. In addition, we're putting an extra high fence along there for noise reduction purposes, so they'll even reduce that potential more. Now, technically, if I walked up to a fence and went like this, I'm overlooking. But practically, they're looking at what's a normal residential level of privacy, which is, your 5 foot, 6 foot paling fence type of idea. So you need to interpret that somewhat practically. Of course, we say that, and the lawyers will say something different, but this was deemed to be acceptable by council. So you can see, one, I need the performance standard, one, I can show how I'm making the solution.
Dan, I've got a question, please. So the very first line, the third column, the third column of proposal complies with P3. Does that mean that forces the council to put it out for public comment through it? Yes.
In this case, it was it would have been advertised anyway because it was a rezoning and development, and the rezoning still would have been a discretionary use in the new zone. But if it was something, say it was from a permitted use, and this was the only thing that tripped me up, by complying with the performance standards as opposed to the acceptable solution would have therefore triggered an advertising, yes.
And so when people comment, like anyone puts a comment in, they can only comment on the top line, not the bottom line?
No, they can comment on any aspect, but council's discretion, and the word discretion means the ability to refuse. So as of section 58, I have the ability to as a permitted development, I have the ability to approve or approve with conditions. As a discretionary application, I have the discretion to approve with conditions, or refuse. So that issue about discretion is limited to council exercising a discretion. Now, the tribunal have not made that 100% clear because the time they dealt with it was when they tried to refuse it on the basis of, a non-compliance with an on a matter that was met the acceptable solution because it was advertised for another reason. But council has to take this into account anyway. But they couldn't, in my opinion, if someone raised an issue about overlooking, and I said, well, I meet the requirements of A4, they would have to consider it and address it, but in my opinion, they can't impose they would really struggle to impose a significant condition with regard to it. The reason I say that is if they put on a requirement, we have to build a parting fence, everyone will go, yeah, fine, don't care. Yeah, it's cheap to get away with it, I don't, and so no one will test it. But if they went, oh no, to avoid private overlooking, which we've said we're already meeting, you now need to build a 5 metre high brick fence, you'd say, no, you don't have the power to do that. Because the imposition is so significant and it's raised through something I'm already complying with. However, they could say, no, we don't agree that you meet A4, we believe that you meet P4, and therefore we'll exercise the discretion on it. That would be the way I'd do it if I was council and wanted to do something about it. But of course, some of them aren't quite as slightly ambiguous as that. They'll be, setback is 3 metres, and you'll go, well, yeah, well, they're 3.5 metres, aren't they? So they clearly comply, and I can't get around that compliance. The reason I put these in when I do it is because I don't want any assumptions of council. I'll make them very clear. I'm relying on P3, I'm meeting A4. Don't tell me any different. Right, so cool. Last one. Now, I realise we don't live in a perfect world, and that quite often we're dealing, if we use the example of people coming to council, no one wants to come to council. No one wants to walk in and say, here, take my money. KFC maybe, McDonald's, not council. So normally people are pissed off when they walk into council. It's probably a good way to start how most conversations start at council. Representors don't want to write representations. They wish the whole thing would go away and they didn't have to be involved. So they're normally ticked off as well. And council obviously has, a lot of people have got lots of baggage that work at council because of years of people being ticked off by coming to council. So, that all aside, pretending we live in a real world, what do you think the expectations of the planning authority are of the applicant? If I'm council, what do you think I expect of you as an applicant? Haven't got any thoughts?
You're honest?
Being honest. Top of the list, 100%. I expect that you're not hiding anything or trying to trick me up or telling me you want... This is a 4th bedroom and a storage area under my house. No, it's a granny flat. No, it's a 4th bedroom and a storage area. I've got no idea how many times I've argued that between people. So, expect to be honest. What else do you think? It's not an exhaustive list, but...
Partial? Partial.
How do you mean partial?
Being strictly neutral when you're assessing.
Yeah, no, I probably don't think that's the case. As the applicant, you've got a vested interest. If it's your upstairs extension, you've got passion about it. It's going to be great. I'm going to have my parents retreat upstairs, kids will be downstairs. It's going to be brilliant. This is what I've always wanted. I'm thinking me ahead in about 5 years' time. Yep. So, you're generally, as an applicant, are going to be emotionally and financially invested in this process. So I don't expect that you're going to be very impartial. You're going to want it. And everyone who objects to it are idiots, will be what you're thinking. How can they not want it? This is such a brilliant solution. Yep.
If you're the applicant you want them to be well informed about what they're doing?
Yeah, so I expect that the applicant be well informed.
Because they can go to the consultants and they can give them selective information.
Yep.
So they have to be aware of what they're presenting to them and what they're presenting to council.
Yep. And as council, I'm trying to educate you as an applicant so you're well informed. And you're not then going to say, oh God, Daniel gave me the wrong advice, told me it'll be fine, whereas I'm saying, no, it's not fine, you have these issues to overcome. Well, they're probably the two I'd say most. Probably the other one is respectful. I was working at council one day, one of the other people at the counter, one of my planning colleagues, and she told the lady who was making inquiry over the counter something that the lady didn't like, so she picked up the ruler and hit her with it because she told her something she didn't like. So I would hope that the applicant will be reasonably respectful and understand that I'm here as a planner representing council. I don't take it personally because I dislike you. I'm as impartial as possible. What do you think the expectations of the applicant? Oh, sorry, I flipped them around, didn't I? Okay. Pretend we've just done that one. What do you think the expectations about the planning authority by the applicant are? So we'll take well informed because I understand you were looking at the dot point, not listening to what I was saying as I was mangling it. So obviously, we'd expect, if I'm the applicant, that the guy or girl, how can I use genuine, neutral? The person behind the counter is well informed of process. Now, as a consultant, that upsets me significantly. I ring up council. Can I come and see someone about this? This is what I'm doing. I'm a planning consultant. You know, I've looked at your scheme. I want to discuss about this particular. Yeah, sure. Just come in and ask for Mary. I go, ask for our planning officer. So I come in and ask for the planning officer, and they come out and I say, this is what I'm doing. Yes, have you read the planning scheme? Yes, I have. I know that. Well, I'll just go check with someone on that. And I said, well, what do you? I've already told you who I am and that I'm this far through the process and I have this understanding, and you're taking me back to here. You're not respectful of me as the applicant, and you're not well informed. You don't know, frankly, what you're talking about. Now, I understand that people are going to have different levels of knowledge, and that's why we communicate, to try to therefore match up the right people to talk to the right people. So my expectation as an applicant is your council, that you're going to be well informed and able to help me, able to answer my questions. What other expectations will I have as the applicant?
Professionalism?
Yes, that you're professional. That you behave properly, you don't, get on the phone. No, you never know, I just saw you, what they're watching, Don't laugh at it. But it's not recent anymore. What was it, 10 years ago, 15 years ago in Victoria, there was, bribery going on that was exposed, of council officers. One of the council officers was in a relationship with one of the developers and was getting preferential treatment. So yes, clearly it wasn't professional. There was a significant issue about ethics with the Planning Institute at the time because of that one. And the other aspect of that is that I act professionally. So I speak to you properly, I treat you with respect, I do all those things that you would expect of me as a planning authority. One more thing I would say. Anyone else got any other thoughts?
Communication, as in you communicate properly what is expected.
I do what I say I'm going to do, and I keep my word, and I let you know what's going on. Yes. The last thing I want to know is I get sent something in the mail saying, it was refused. What do you mean it's refused? Why didn't you tell me about it? Or a further information request. Here's a good example. We talked about building trust and rapport with the people at council. We had a surveyor who was a very common applicant at council, and our relationship developed to, he'd come in, he'd lodge an application, and sometimes if there was not enough time, he might just leave it with us and say, look, you know, can you look over that and lodge it, and I'll come back in and pay the fees, you know, this afternoon, and we'd do it, you know, that's fine. He's missing something, we look at it the next day. Hey mate, can you drop that titling? Because if I don't get it in the next hour, it's not going to make the paper on Saturday. Yeah, great, thanks for letting me know. And he'd run over and give it to me. I didn't have to write further information letter. He wasn't delayed by 3 days for his client. Why? Because we had a good rapport. And a simple phone call, I said, I'll give you a ring if there's anything missing and you can fix it straight away. And I did that. So that's what he expected of me as a planning authority. And that we communicated. There's an issue, come in and talk about it. However, here's the, I suppose, the flip side. As a member of the public, what do you expect of the applicant? We know what you expect of council. You expect of council to agree with you, but what do you expect of the applicant if you're the neighbour or a general member of the public?
Give them proper notice.
Yeah, you expect things to be, in this case in Tassie, the councils generally are doing the notice giving, as opposed to in Victoria where the individual's doing the notice giving. But can you expand on that a bit more maybe about?
I guess you're not required so much to give notice, but it'd be a courteous thing to give notice.
If I was a neighbour and you were doing a development, I'd expect you to come over, knock on my door. Dan, I'm going to lodge this with council next week, and you know, you might be interested in what's going on. Do you want to have a look and have a chat? That's you and me being good neighbours, isn't it? I may not agree with you, and you'll say that's fine, but I just thought I'd give you the courtesy of coming and talking to you. I think that's something I would expect as a neighbour. What about if, so by the time the formal notice comes, they know what's going on. And they look and go, oh yeah, that looks like what he said he was going to do, yeah. But what about if you're the general public?
Will it match up the action? Will it match up the actions?
How do you mean?
I mean, what the proposal present is actually.
Yeah, okay, yes. Honesty. So as the applicant, they are going to do what they said they were going to do. So they said they were going to open a clothes shop. They're not going to, therefore, run a takeaway food shop. You know, that they weren't trying to fool council, that they were being open and honest. That they come and saw me and said, here's what I'm looking at doing, Dan, and it showed an extension out the back, then they didn't go and lodge an application for an upstairs extension. You know, that they were open and honest. So, and I think, look, that's probably top on all of them. Why do I say that? That's because wherever you work in this process, I think you need to be willing to take it on for yourself as well as expect it of anyone else. Last thing, things to look at for as part of that lodgement, because things are changing. How does council want it to be lodged? Previously, when I first started, it had to be 3 copies, you know, all hard copies, etc. Which meant that when I was lodging, when I became a consultant, lodging lots of documentation, then council would go, oh, we've just got to scan it and put it on our website. Oh, would you like it on USB? Yeah, that'd be a great idea, thanks. So, and as a consultant, this costs money. Hard copy documentation costs money. If council says, well, yeah, just give us one hard copy and give us the USB or put on a DVD or something, that's great. That saves my client money, okay? The easy way is talk to council. What do you want? I'll give it to you any way you want. You just tell me. It also saves time and effort because, you know, if I've got to run off a whole bunch of copies for things, you know, that can take me a lot of time. Understanding very early on what the fees are. Quite often council's fees are based upon certain aspects and they say, oh, we can't confirm it until you lodge the application. You say, well, look, okay, can you give me a copy of your fee structure so I can work it out? Sometimes it's like drawing teeth, which really annoys me because I know when I was on the other side, I was trying to be helpful to people. Well, it's going to be either this or this or this, and these are the dependencies. If you're not sure, come back in and we'll go through it. You know? I wanted to be helpful. I didn't want to be the person that they complained about. But it's really important that we understand that, particularly communicating with our clients. And as you point out, communication right through both ways, right through the process. The more we can be involved in a two-way or a three-way conversation, the more likely we are to get a successful outcome for all parties. Any questions?